Welcome, everybody, to another episode of You Learn, You Turn. I am thrilled today that I have Eric Zimmer joining us and also our famous Rich Jones from the U-Turn Health Company. Most everybody listening probably knows Eric because he's pretty famous right now with one of his. Yeah, you really are. But Eric Zimmer, I'm going to read a quick bio, is the host of the award-winning podcast, The One You Feed, based on an old parable about two wolves at battle within us. He is also a behavior coach, certified interfaith spiritual director, and writer. He has a personal recovery story, which I hope he'll share some of that with us. And he's just a wealth of information about behavior change and recovery and all things about life. So welcome, Eric, to You Learn, You Turn.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. Rich, do you want to, you guys want to banter a little bit and tell each other, like, Rich, a little bit about your background, and Eric?
I'll tell you a little bit about my backstory. So I'm a person in long-term recovery for 23 years from an opioid use disorder and an alcohol use disorder, and a licensed therapist and all that kind of stuff that you get along the way. And been working in the field basically since I got into recovery. So I listened to your TED Talk and been following you and really vibe with your take on behavior change and the way that you think about it and the way that you approach it. One of the things that U-Turn Health that we're really trying to get out there is there are alternative ways for people to get better. There are many different ways for people to get better. And we feel like we need to talk about all those different ways and not just pigeonhole people into this one size fits all kind of paradigm. If you're going to get better from substance use or mental health or even just everyday life events, what are all the different ways to get it done? And you definitely have a pathway that's very attractive. So thank you for joining us.
I want to back up real quick. I forgot to ask you the questions. I'm so sorry. What did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, wow. That is a question that I think the best answer I could give is at some point in high school, I decided I wanted to be a writer. I think that was what I wanted to be. I don't know if before that I had ideas about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I think at one point maybe a lawyer, but God knows where that came from. I think my grandfather was a lawyer. But I've never been good at really being like having long-term plans about like what I really want to be. But in high school, the written word definitely captured my attention. And, I grew to love novelists like John Steinbeck and Jack Kerouac and many others. And so I was like, I want to do that.
Have you written
a book? So when you think about, sorry for interrupting, Liz, but it's interesting. So did you follow that out and pursue that at all? Was it something that you went for, or how did that play out?
Well, no, because I left high school and descended deep into substance abuse and addiction. And then when I got sober at 25, I was just trying to piece together any semblance of a normal life. So at that point, like the normal, like having a career path seemed like an amazing idea. I never went to college. So once I found a little bit of a path and it was in the software world, I kind of just followed that for a while. It wasn't until later that I sort of came back around a little bit more to wanting to do something that had more to do with healing. And I also just recognized like I didn't love writing. There's a reason I started a podcast and not a blog. I love talking to people. And now I am at work on a book and some different things, but that feels more like I've got something I want to say. And so I want to get it out there and say it. It's less about me wanting to be a writer anymore. Like I don't have that as an identity necessarily.
Right.
But I do remember high school thinking I wanted to be a writer. Probably in elementary school, I wanted to be a sports star or something. Who knows?
Yeah, that's the only thing I remember. I was going to be a professional athlete. I wasn't sure what sport it was going to be in. And then I found out I was way too short, way too slow, way too not talented.
Yep.
And then addiction entered the picture and kind of took, I can relate a lot to that idea of like addiction derailing us and kind of whatever we were thinking we were going to be gets put on hold.
Yep.
Eric, do you want to go back to that time? Because I know a lot of our listeners don't know your story. I know it pretty well, but so how did you go from high school to and get to where you are today? Not everything, of course, but just through your addiction to heroin. Can you take us back to when that started?
Sure. I drank a few times in high school, and I did it very strangely. In retrospect, I can look at it and be like, that was not normal, but I didn't do it a lot. And I
Yep.
formed a tutoring program for where we were tutoring disadvantaged children, and I saw what alcohol and drugs was doing in their family's life and subsequently to them. And so I became kind of straight edge, and I was like, I'm not going to do anything. But after high school, I went away for a while, and I came back, and my best friend was dating my girlfriend, and I was in a lot of pain. And one day somebody said, "You want a drink?" And I said, "Sure." And it almost from that moment on, I feel like I rarely drew a sober breath for the next 7 years, probably, right? I was just off to the races, drinking and then pot and then, whatever else. I was playing in rock bands, and eventually I got into a band with people who were using heroin, and I started doing that. And that just greatly sped up my ascent to the bottom. In some ways, I'm grateful that I found heroin in that way, because it what might have taken me 10 or 15 years to get bad enough with alcohol and marijuana got bad in like 3 years. So I got sober at the age of 25 from that. I did it through a detox program and through 12-step programs. Then I stayed sober about 8 years, and then I went back out and I started drinking again. I never went back to the heroin. I was drinking, I was smoking pot. And the fact that I'm on this show now tells you that I had to get sober again. It didn't work out. But it was very different, because my bottom from heroin was a very low bottom. I was homeless. I weighed 100 pounds. I had hepatitis C. I had potential jail sentences of 50 to 60 years hanging over my head. And when I got sober, about 3 or 4 years after I started drinking again, I was living in the suburbs. I was driving a BMW. I had the best job I'd ever had. On the outside, everything was fine. But I knew on the inside that I was just as sick as I had been then. It's just the nature of alcohol and the laws around alcohol and all that made it a different animal. So I got sober from that. That was about 15 years ago. Shortly after getting sober, I decided that I didn't want to do what I had been doing, which was all in the software business, primarily software startup companies. And I decided to start a solar energy company. And I founded a solar energy company that ran about 5 years here in Columbus, Ohio. And the laws around renewable energy just kept changing in Ohio. They just kept changing, and I'd have $5 or $10 million in deals lined up, and then the legislatures would announce, we're pausing the renewable portfolio standard for 6 months, and all my investors would run to the hills. And I would put it all back together. About the third time that happened, I was like, I can't do this. And I was kind of brokenhearted, and I stopped doing it. I went back. I was doing consulting work in the software space, but I was bored, and I just got the idea to do this podcast where I would talk to other people about what it means to live a good life. And I needed it at that point. I was kind of heartbroken from my solar energy company. I was in a really bad marriage at the time. I needed to be having conversations with people about what it meant to live a good life. And so I was like, if I'm reading these books anyway, so I'll be reading their book. I'll be having conversations with them. It'll be good for me. And that was a decade ago or so, just about a decade ago that we started that. And so that kind of starting the podcast kind of led me into my current world and path today. So hopefully that's
awesome.
Broad enough overview.
Can you tell our listeners, I feel like you talk about this on every podcast you're ever on, but the one you feed, tell us about that parable. What's that from, and what does it mean to you?
And how did you get turned on to it?
Yeah. So, I heard the parable early on in recovery the first time, probably in some crappy church basement somewhere.
Yep.
And the parable is basically, the short version is we all have two wolves inside of us that are at battle. One is a good wolf, which represents things like kindness and bravery and love. And the other is a bad wolf, which represents things like greed and hatred and fear. And which wolf wins? Well, the one you feed. So that's the name of the podcast. And when I heard that parable the first time, it just really, really resonated with me because I was very early in recovery and I was being presented with some pretty clear and stark choices. Here were the things that I was being told, the actions I could take, the thought patterns I could try and embrace that would lead to me becoming sober and healthy. And here were the ones that I could embrace that I knew were leading me either to jail for a long time or to death. I had hepatitis C, like I said. I weighed 100 pounds. I mean, I was dying. So it was really stark at that point. I sometimes joke it wasn't even so much like I was feeding the bad wolf anymore, so much as the bad wolf was devouring me at that point.
Right.
But it really meant a lot to me. But I've been able to reflect on that parable all through different aspects of my life and see that, at a fundamental level, it shows that the choices we make about what we do, what we think, they matter. They matter. And they may not be as dramatic for me as they were when I was 10 days sober off heroin, right? But they still are really important in the direction that my life goes.
Absolutely.
Or they matter in a different way, right? Like, so like I can relate to all of that you're talking about. And like how when you're in early recovery, the desperation of it and the clarity of it. I don't know what it was like for you, but I remember being like, the choices were so stark and so like, black and white.
Yeah.
And then as you move into your recovery further, I feel like we run into a lot of like life on life term kind of stuff, but it's not maybe as urgent. That might not be the best word for it, but it doesn't hit us with the same urgency, right? I'm going to eat, some bad processed food today that I know is going to put me in a bad mood. That's different than I'm going to go out and grab a handful of pills. It's going to take me back out to addiction. So it's like, but the choices are the same. The idea is the same.
Yeah. And what do I want to say here? Each individual choice isn't as fraught with danger, but each individual choice points me in a certain direction. And if I make enough of those small bad choices, I think I'd find my way back to addiction. I mean, that's how I was sober 8 years and went back out and started drinking again. I started making a series of very small, poor choices over and over and over and over again until suddenly the idea of drinking seemed like it made sense. So the stakes aren't as fraught on every individual choice, but I do think, at least in my case, the overall direction is the same. And I'm somebody who's wrestled with depression. So, these choices they can accumulate and they can snowball pretty quickly. And I think a lot about upward and downward spirals, right? Addiction is a downward spiral. You feel bad, so you use, and then you sober up and you either feel bad about the fact that you used, or you feel bad about something you did while you used. And all of a sudden then, how do you deal with feeling bad? You use again and onward, and the spiral goes down. And the same thing tends to be true in my life about positive choices. A positive choice to get up this morning and exercise is likely to lead to a positive choice to eat a decent lunch, which is likely to lead to, choosing to, read a book versus spend 2 hours on my phone playing a game. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with playing games on your phone, right? These are choices for every individual person. I know which ones lead me towards recovery from addiction, from depression, and just being a happier person.
Yeah.
And so I look at these, I look at every individual choice as being important because there's a, I study Buddhism a lot and we talk about karma, right? And it shows up in Buddhism and Hinduism. And I kind of boil that down to a very simple idea. And to me, it just means that the ways that I think and behave make it more likely I'm going to think and behave that way in the future. It sets something in motion. And now this is not to say that every time you eat processed food, it's a crisis and you're going to be reborn to a hell realm or you're going to end up shooting heroin in 8 hours, right? Like that's being awfully
the donut to the dope, just like that.
Right. And so obviously there's a certain amount of grace of saying like, well, yeah, okay, I made a mistake. No big deal. Right. Or I didn't, today's a day and I just, I felt lousy today and I just decided, what, I'm just going to give myself a day to watch TV and eat. But a bunch of days like that, and I can find myself in a difficult spot quickly. And it all goes back to the parable. It's that these choices all matter, not only in their impact, but in the likelihood that the choice I make is going to influence the next choice.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, so to that end, and Liz, I'm sorry, tell me if I'm talking too much.
No, please. No.
And but I think when you were talking about your story and you were talking about your first run at recovery, you had a substantial amount of time together, and then you went back, quote unquote, went back out. Were you still engaging in recovery related activities like during that period of time before you went back out? Or had you pulled back from it? What was it like for you?
Yeah, I pulled back. I mean, you know, I met the mother of my son and my first wife at a heroin dealer's house, right? So you can assume that this is not an auspicious beginning to a relationship.
Yeah.
But we both got sober around the same time. We did it separately, and then we came back together, and we had Jordan, my son, kind of unexpectedly, but we embraced it. And when Jordan was about 2, she came home one day and said, I fall in love with someone else in AA, and I'm leaving, or you're leaving, and I'm going to be in a relationship with this guy. And by the way, you know, him and Jordan hang out, and I was devastated, and I was angry at AA. I know that's ridiculous, right?
No,
like,
well, no, I get it. I get
yeah,
it.
like,
Yeah.
I mean, even I knew on one level it was ridiculous, and yet it's how I felt. And so I just started to pull back, and I was really hurt. And I didn't drink after that for a number of years, maybe 3 years. But I just started making poor choices. I stopped being as involved in recovery, and I just began to become very involved in myself. And some of that involvement in myself was good. It was related to healing, trauma, and other things that I needed to do. But some of it became very focused on how I feel, and I started to become promiscuous, and I started smoking cigarettes. I had never smoked a cigarette in my life. I became a heroin addict, and I was like, but I won't smoke a cigarette, no way.
Yeah.
So I started smoking cigarettes, which was like another clear sign, like things are going off the rails here. So yeah, I withdrew from recovery, and I became very self-involved, and those two things are, you know, and when I say withdraw from recovery, because I've withdrawn from 12-step recovery.
Right.
I was going to ask
now,
that.
But I don't feel like I've withdrawn from a recovery process. But
Right.
in that case, I had, you know, to a certain degree. And so, so that's kind of how I got there, is a bunch of very small, bad choices that over time accumulated until I went, you know, drinking seems like it'd be fine.
Right.
You know?
What could be the big deal there? Yeah.
And it was for a little while.
I'm sorry. What do you do today for recovery program? Do you just do it yourself, or?
Well, yes and no. You know, at a certain point, I found myself wanting to withdraw from 12-step programs. And we can talk about what it was about 12-step programs I loved and what it was about 12-step programs that began to feel limiting to me. But I eventually hit a point where I didn't feel like it was the place that I was going to grow the most.
Gotcha.
But I was afraid. I was like, I've done this before and it didn't end well. Yeah. So what I did was I tried to sort of analyze, like, what am I getting from a 12-step program? Like, what is it about this that works for me? And then can I find ways to make sure those components are in my life? So, you know, a big one is the community. Yeah. You know, do I have people I can talk to about what's going on with me? And further, do I have an opportunity to be of service to other people? Because that's one of the things that 12-step community gives you right away, is there's always new people coming in the door. So there's always somebody to help. You get outside of that, it's harder. Now, my podcast has given me lots of opportunities to help lots of people in lots of different ways. And it's given me a community, and I have good friendships. So I was like, okay, I've got that, you know, those two components, you know, community and a way to be of service. And then the next was a spiritual connection. And I kind of had that. I've always been interested in that, and I was able to pursue that. And then finally, the last thing is some sort of structured program of getting better, right? The 12 steps are a formalized method to try and work with difficult thoughts and emotions.
Right.
And
Yep.
so did I have that in other places? And I was able to find that through, different things over the years. Sometimes it was programs I created and trying to live by those programs. Sometimes it was being, a very serious Zen student for a number of years. Sometimes, so, I was always just looking to, are those components still active in my life? And if so, then I feel like I am in recovery,
I agree
even
with you
though I'm not
100%. Yeah.
directly in a recovery community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can weigh in on that, Eric, so our philosophy at U-Turn Health, we call it multiple pathways to recovery. And we know what the facts are is that people get this many different ways. It's
Yep.
interesting. It's interesting, those kind of pillars of recovery that you talk about. There is a theme across pretty much every recovery group or any recovery experience where a lot of those type of things, that is what people are working on, especially when you talk about the self-improvement part. I can't tell you the number of folks. I'll tell you this real quick as a backstory so you know a little bit about where I got this information. I was running a nonprofit in South Carolina, and as the doors were open, free services, people coming in at all stages of the recovery process. And I'm telling you, as true as I'm sitting here, I would get multiple people when I asked them what their program was. They would talk about, well, I stay away from people, places, and things. I don't hang out with people who use. And I'm trying to better my life physically. I'm trying to change the way I kind of conduct. And then they would always talk about self-improvement. And many people would talk about listening to podcasts as their main support for recovery. And I remember other people would hear people say that and they would be like, that's not going to work. That's not a meeting. But in my mind, it is the same principles. It's fascinating the way that you articulated it, but it is the same principles, right? Same type of stuff.
It makes AA really nervous when people seem to be doing just fine outside of the rooms.
Yeah. I mean, yes and no. There are people in AA who defend AA as the only way to get sober, and they become hypercritical of anything else, and they think that. But I also think there's a lot of people in AA who also are believe what believe what the big book says. Like there are many different paths, right? And so. I think people who are able to be a little more open-minded, which is many people, they just often more quiet than the louder people in AA. Many people will recognize that. And I do think there are multiple paths, and I do think podcasts are a very useful tool. Where I think that the potential limiting factor there is being able to talk to someone else about what you're going through.
The community part, the actual community part.
And that doesn't have to be a community like you have in AA where you go to, 5 meetings a week and 50 different people. That community could be 2 people. But I do tend to believe that most people facing a serious enough addiction are going to need support from others.
I agree.
To some degree to get through it. That a therapist might be enough. I mean, it can look differently for everybody, but I think if you're just kind of off on your own listening to podcasts, while that is helpful, part I think of recovery is connecting back to our world. Back to your world.
For all kinds of different reasons, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
But lots of different ways there. Lots of different ways there.
One of the most interesting things about the sense of community that I've learned along the way is the way it impacts dopamine in our brain, right? It's literally a way to raise dopamine, being around other people that you enjoy being around and you feel safe and you feel content and you feel connection to. It will help repair your brain. That's why I think in early recovery, regardless of what you think about 12-steps rooms, they're everywhere. You can go to a meeting all the time. And it's a great thing to do because it's going to get you back into the human race.
Yeah. I mean, they saved my life twice. I mean, I want to be clear. I don't think I would have made it, certainly the first time for sure, and probably not the second time, because that was 15 years ago, almost 16 years ago. There wasn't a lot of other options on the table in Columbus, Ohio. So they saved my life twice. So I have a lot of reverence and respect for what they can do. And I agree with you that there are benefits to them that simply nothing else has. They are everywhere. You can find a meeting, you can find people. There's just a lot of ways to plug in. And it's a program that has worked for millions of people. It does work.
Absolutely.
And most of the objections that people have to it can also be overcome. I'm not saying all the time, but there are ways to work within a 12-step program. And so many people object to the religious aspect,
Yes.
what they would consider the religious aspect. But I think about the wisdom of the early AA members, way back in 1939, to add one little phrase to the end of step 3, which was God as we understand him.
Yeah.
I think that line has saved millions of lives.
It's way ahead of its time.
Which
it was way ahead of its time. Yeah.
And it's real. It means that you don't have to accept other people's idea of what God is. Now, if you live in a small town somewhere in rural America, people, when they talk about God, are probably talking about God in a fairly narrow way. And that may be hard. That may be difficult to handle if that way of relating doesn't work for you. But even in a mid-sized city like Columbus, Ohio, you can find plenty of meetings where people's idea of God is pretty plural and multiculturalistic and very open. There are meetings for atheists and agnostics, and I mean, there's a lot of diversity within AA. We tend to talk about AA as if it was this uniform thing. And it is not in any way, shape, or form, right? Many, many different groups are very, very different. And so, I think if you're trying to find your way into recovery and AA is what is available and it is free, it's worth checking out a variety of meetings before you make a decision that AA is all one way, because different groups can be very different.
Exactly. I agree. I've had the same experience. Absolutely.
I was just going to say
the other thing I was... Go ahead,
real
Liz.
quick. I went to a meeting last week because I still do go, because those are my friends, those are my people. But someone said I can't remember where the guy was from, New Mexico, maybe. He said that they only have 4th and 5th step meetings. They go in, the newcomer sits there, and the people that have been in recovery the longest sit across from them, and they just start telling their story. And then the newcomer turns around and does the same thing right back. And that is the only way they do it. It's 4th and 5th step meetings. And one other observation is that we do say it's the God of your understanding and all that, but in the South, we end with the Lord's Prayer. And I'm like, if you're new and you are an atheist and we say we don't care and it's a spiritual program, it doesn't have to, and then we all hold hands at the end. I've seen the look on some people's faces. They're like, what are we doing?
Totally. Well, I think that's more than just the South. I mean, Ohio is not exactly the South. I mean, I remember when I was really involved in AA, I brought every group conscience. I was like, we need to stop saying the Lord's Prayer at the end of the meeting. I get that it's tradition. I understand all that. We could just say the Serenity Prayer again.
Yep.
Like, there's no reason to pigeonhole that. There's no reason to make somebody uncomfortable with a prayer that is from a very specific Christian tradition. Like, and I think for people who hold to it, you might say, well, what if I was forced to say, the Muslims' prayer, at the end of it, or, the Jewish is difficult because it has its roots in Christianity, or I made you chant some weird Tibetan, jewel cherishing ceremony, right? So I do agree with you that I think that could be done away with almost no harm.
Yeah. What did they say?
And to great benefit.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we eventually did it, but I was with a group of my home group was a bunch of younger people. And, I was 25, 26, 27 in those years. And so, but there were people who were very much like, well, this is just the way it's always been done. And, you don't mess with what works. And, this is what Dr. Bob and Bill did. And so we should do it. And, but I think we eventually did away with it.
There are fundamentalists in every group, right? In every
Everywhere.
organization, anything like that. There are people that have the answer. My observation on AA is kind of interesting. Like, you can even within AA have home groups that feel like they do it right versus the rest of AA. You'll get to not only is AA the only way to do it, my particular brand of AA is the only way to do it.
Oh yeah. Fundamentalism is everywhere. And I've made my peace with it because it's what works for some people. If it didn't work for some people, it wouldn't exist, and there are people that need that, like, this is the way, this is the only way, this is the right way, you do it my way. And for some personality types or certain people in certain situations, that is what works. It makes my blood kind of boil.
Yeah.
Like anytime anybody acts certain of anything, I will argue against them, even if I believe what they're saying, because it's just, I don't think life is that way. I don't think life is clean and anybody knows the answers. But yeah, I agree with all that.
When I was at the nonprofit, I spent a lot of time researching like the history of AA, partly to kind of like push back on objections we were getting, because we opened the doors wide and said like multiple pathways. Even if you're not interested in quitting, you can still come over here. We're going to help you figure it out. And you would have thought that we were like doing bong hits and keg stands in the meeting. Like people and people were getting real mean about it. They would start saying stuff about me personally. And it was like I was kind of ripping away the fabric of AA or something. And that was never the intention at all. It was always just more open the doors wider. But here was an interesting observation. You said it earlier, Eric. The people that were quiet, the people that had been around AA for a while and were listening and were quiet, they were always receptive to what we were up to at the nonprofit. They were always down with it. And if they ever came over and talked to me about it and learned about it, they supported it 100%. The people who didn't, the phrase is contempt without investigation. Yeah, you guys suck over there. You're doing it wrong, and we don't even want to hear what you're doing because it's so bad. And that's where it got weird. That's where it got real weird.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate that those people who are fundamentalists tend to often be the loudest.
Exactly.
And so if you're newer to AA, that's what you think AA is all about. And the people who want to criticize AA will pull those people out as, that's what AA is. But it's the same sort of thing I think we do in our political dialogue very often, right? We'll pick the worst example of somebody on the other side and make that the representation of everyone that's on that side.
Right.
And I think people will do that both for and against AA, right? They will pick the worst example of a AA person, somebody who's very fundamentalist and an older man who likes to flirt with all the younger women, and they'll say, that's AA. Well, no, it's not. No, it's not. Yeah. That's a person in AA. That's not AA. And vice versa. Somebody would say about you, who wanted to protect AA, that you're just this, you don't know what you're talking about, and you're playing fast and loose with people's lives. And it just, but I think, like you were saying, Liz, that most people are working from the quieter people. They have a deeper understanding.
Yeah.
Eric, I know you're a behavior coach, and I've listened to, like your TED Talk, and you talk on some other podcasts, and I really, really get stuck on, especially because the 12 steps were completely supposed to change my behavior in every way, shape, or form. My defects were out the window. Wasn't going to be full of fear anymore. And if I was, I'm not doing it right. Well, that was 17 years ago. I'm still fearful. I still wake up depressed, anxious. I've tried, Bible studies. I've tried medication. I've done everything, and listening to you and your voice is so soothing, but also the way you talk about changing your behavior. And it almost seems too simple to be true. Like, start small, do it every day, have accountability partners. Can you speak to the people who, like me, have tried a lot of different things, psilocybin, all these things that trying to make me a different person? Am I stuck like this?
Well, I guess I would have to ask you a bunch of questions before I would make any sort of idea or suggestion, because you're describing emotional states. Okay. You weren't describing behavior.
True.
So it's possible that your behaviors in life are generally life-affirming, positive, and good, and you also suffer from mood disorders that make you feel bad some of the time, right? So those are different things, right? And now that may be both, right? So I guess that would be my first question to you. Are we really talking about behavior, or are we talking about mood and emotion?
Mood and emotion.
Well, the other thing that I would throw out there, Liz, is what is it that you're actually chasing, and does it even exist? Are you chasing like this
Peace.
mythical creature, right? That is like peaceful and full of serenity all the time. And
Yes.
part of me believes that we've been sold a bill of goods, not in AA, but in America, for example, that if we do certain things and we accumulate certain things and we act the right way and we're a good person, we'll arrive at this place of like peace, serenity. And I don't think anybody gets there all the time, if that makes sense. I think that's why therapists exist and why we're seeing so many problems in our country right now.
Yeah.
Is it attainable to have
Yeah.
that is part of the question.
Well, and the behavior thing, like I do the days that I work out, I meditate, I do some readings, I reach out to somebody in need. When I do all those things, I don't have as much fear and anxiety. So I guess
Yeah.
I really need you to tell our audience and me, and Rich, you probably got it all figured out. How can we make incremental changes to our life that will result in like maybe big changes, which will inevitably affect our emotions and our
Yep.
moods?
So this is a complex subject and everybody's a little different, but I will give you a framework that I sort of think through. And I think there are two core elements to being able to change our behavior. And the first is what I would call structural things. They have to do with, are we taking on too much? Do we know how to plan? Do we know how to respond when we get off track? Because inevitably we will. Do we know how to respond when, something we had planned to do doesn't work? Do we have accountability partners? Have we set up our environment to support? So there's a lot of structural things. And this is what the science of behavior change is all about. And there's lots to learn and do there. There is a lot about our approach, right? But then there's another element to it. And this is more sort of what I would call emotional regulation. Meaning you've got a good plan, you've got everything kind of figured out, you're doing the right thing, you're trying to take on the right amount, you've got all that going, and nothing has gotten in your way. It's just 9 a.m. and you're supposed to get on the exercise bike and you just don't. Right? That is what I would call a failure of emotional regulation. And what I mean is something is going on inside of you at that moment. You may be conscious of it, you may not, that is blocking you from doing it. And so the way I work with people is first, let's get all the structural stuff down. Let's give you the best absolute chance because it will clean up a lot of the problem. And then you find yourself not doing the behavior. And I don't mean just once. Everybody doesn't do it just once, right? Everybody has a bad day where they're like, I can't, like for whatever reason. But consistently, I'm at a choice point. And that's one of the things about making plans and being specific is you get forced to a choice point, right? Because a lot of times our behavior goals are ambiguous enough. We never get forced to a choice point. I'm going to exercise tomorrow. Well, you're never at a point where it's time to exercise. Yeah. I'm going to run tomorrow at 9 a.m. for 15 minutes around my block. That's a choice point. 9 a.m. arrives. So now if I'm not doing it, I have to say, what's going on inside me in that moment that causes me to turn away? And a lot of times we're not conscious of it because it happens so fast. It's like 9 a.m. is coming. I know I should run. And then all of a sudden I pick up my phone and I check out for 30 minutes and now it's 9:30 and I don't have time to do it. And I feel bad and I go on with my day. Right? So it's about bringing some awareness to that moment. What am I saying? You might be saying to yourself, what's the point? What's the point? I've been running every day for like 2 weeks and I guess I feel a little bit better, but still it doesn't really matter. So there's the whole, what's the point?
Fascinating.
There's the whole, it's too hard. There's the whole, I'm too tired. There's a lot, you'll find different things inside of you that are being spoken and they're very subtle. And so if I can figure out what those are, then I can work on, if I'm working with a client, I can work with them on how do you coach yourself through that moment?
How?
Could it be externals as well? So are there like external circumstances? So I'm picturing like Liz is going about her life and doing all right. And and something happens with a kid or something
Oh
happens,
yeah.
and then that knocks you off, and that may be a little bit easier to notice, though, I guess, because it's more obvious.
Yes and no, but these things aren't clear cut. Let's take that example. So, you know, Liz, you're doing well, and every morning at 8 a.m. you're going to go for a run, and one morning comes and one of your children wakes up and they're sick. And you have to take care of the child instead of going running. It is going to happen. Now, what a lot of people will do is they will either completely be like, well, I just did what I had to do and not really think about it, or they'll feel really bad about themselves. And their brain will start up with like, here we go again. Every time you've tried to do this before, you do it fine for a month, but then you fail. Why is this time going to be any different? Right?
Negative self-talk.
Yeah. And so what we do in that case is we recognize that for some people, life is going to constantly be throwing surprises your way. If we look at habit research, habits have become a big topic of research, right? And everybody wants to build a habit because you feel like once you have a habit, you do it sort of automatically. But habits that take, in my experience, habits that take a lot of energy, like going to work out, they're harder to make into a habit.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, habits need what's called a stable context. And what a stable context means is that if you plan to work out every morning at 9 a.m., your life needs to more or less look the same every morning at 9 a.m. That is not the case for 90% of the people who will be listening to this. It could be because of children. It could be because of aging parents. It could be both. It could be because your job is demanding. It could be because you have to travel. It could be, there's all these different factors. So part of the structural, getting a plan right, is making a plan that puts you to choice points, but also knowing what you do when it doesn't work that way. How do you become flexible? So there's this, I always say that doing something consistently is this curious mixture of stubbornness, like I'm going to do it, and flexibility. Like I'm not going to be able to do it the way I want to do it all the time. And so that flexibility becomes really important. So I often say a little bit of something is better than a lot of nothing. So let's say it's a day I'm traveling for work and I'm not going to be able to work out that day. Can I walk while I'm waiting on my connecting flight? Can I just spend that hour walking through the airport?
Yeah.
It is a commitment towards my physical well-being. And it keeps the energy of it alive, because it is true that when we're doing something pretty regularly, when you've been going to the gym, 5 days a week for the last month, it's easier to do it than when you haven't been, right? We all know this feeling. It's hard to get started, but momentum does carry us. But momentum will get interrupted because our lives are not stable. They're always changing. They're always flexible. So I just threw a lot at you there. But it's kind of a combination of figuring out all those different things, the plan. And then part of the plan is what's going to happen when I can't do it, because that's inevitable. Now, it may be different for you, Liz, at your age than me at my age. Like my son is 25 and not in the home. And so I don't know what your situation is, but certainly there's people who are listening to this who are like, yeah, I've got 3 kids at home. Their life is very different than mine. I'm self-employed. Most people aren't, right? So my life looks different than their life. And so my plan and my structure is going to be different. How much I can do versus how much you can do might be different. And getting that calibrated right is really important, because if you're trying to do more than you can do, you're going to fail. And then you're going to feel bad about yourself. And then you're probably going to give up.
You also can have
all or nothing. It's not all or nothing.
It is not all or nothing. All or nothing thinking is the absolute antithesis of making consistent behavior change, because everybody, there are certain people in the world who are robotic, right? They just are. There's some people out there, and maybe they write books and we read those books and we think we should be like that. Most of us are not that way. And most of us would not want to be that way, right? We would not want a life where we said, you know what? kid, I know you're sick, but take care of yourself because I got to do my morning run, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't be living according to our values for most of us. So how do I adapt to the changing circumstances of my life while still prioritizing the things that I've said are important?
And this, I've had this personal experience with, and it's very frustrating and kind of like weird when I go through it because I buy into everything you're talking about, Eric, and I really believe it. But I'll have these moments in my life. It'll usually be something going on with one of my kids, right? And not anything that's discrete, not like a sickness that they can get over, like a lingering issue. And I'll just be real straightforward and transparent. My daughter is diagnosed with bipolar type 1, and she's comfortable with me talking about her stories. She's no shame in our game, that kind of thing. And when she's in a manic phase, even when there's nothing for me to do, even when there's no steps I can take to help her, I find myself having a lot of difficulty with routines.
Yes.
It's like there's like an emotional drain on me that gets me off my game.
Yeah.
And I hate it. It drives me crazy.
Well, so what if you were a coaching client of mine, what I would say is, okay, so we've identified a circumstance that is challenging. What might be my daughter is having a manic episode strategy to your taking care of yourself?
Well,
right?
I actually like, I from listening to you, I think where I would go with it, because I listened to your TED Talk too, and what I love is whenever you go small with it, and it's this because okay, I can't go out like I like my main go-to thing to work out is this thing called Go Ruck, and you like put a backpack on, and it's like fake hiking, I guess you would call it, and so I might not do that, but can I get out and go for a walk around the building? All that stuff you said, yeah.
So, for example, before I was able to do the podcast full time, the last 5 years of my corporate career, I traveled a lot, like, 6 months out of the year, 7 months out of the year. I mean, it was a lot. And that was problematic to routine.
Yeah.
So I would just be like, I'd be doing good at home, and then I'd travel and it would kind of all fall apart. And I'd try and make it work. And I finally was like, you know what I need? I need a travel routine.
Right.
Here's what I do when I'm traveling. And it's very different. I'm going to do, I'm just making this up, 3 sets of 20 push-ups in my room. I'll do 3 sets of 20 sit-ups, and I will make sure I get a 30-minute walk in somewhere. Right. And that's about all that will really work because of the demands on my time and life when I'm traveling.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what I'm saying for you. You could have here's what I do when my daughter is in this phase.
Protocol. Yeah.
Yeah. And the mania protocol is I'm not going to get out and ruck for an hour and a half. Right. Yep. You scale it down. The other thing is that a lot of this stuff is, and this is the almost most simplistic and basic piece of advice that there is, but it's really important, which is get started.
Get started.
Right? Like I literally every time I have ever worked out in my life, and I mean 100% of the time, and at this point we have thousands of data points, every single time afterwards I've gone, that was a great idea. I'm glad I did that. Never once, not one time have I been like, oh God, that was stupid. I shouldn't have done that.
Shouldn't have done
right?
that. Yeah.
Ever. So you would think with that much positive reinforcement that I would run to exercise every morning. I would just wake up and be like, I can't get to it. I can't wait to get to it. But that's not how it is most mornings because I'm fighting being tired. I'm waking up, I'm fighting inertia. And so for me, far more often than I would ever think is reasonable, I have to do the version of one of mine is a Peloton bike. Just put on your bike shorts, your shoes, and clip into the bike. That's all you have to do, Eric. Just do that. Yep. Just do that. And I can usually get myself to do that. And then once I'm clipped in, I'll be like, well, just do the warm up. If after the warm up you don't want to do it, you can quit. And 98% of the time, I finish the workout.
Yeah.
Right. And so, because I think some of what happens with this stuff, right? Let's stay on you and your daughter, right? Your emotional reserves are taxed. I don't know exactly what you're feeling. You might be feeling overwhelmed. You might be feeling depressed. You might be
Fear,
feeling
sadness,
tired. Yep.
all that. Yeah.
And so I think that when we are in a certain situation and we think about doing something, and you think about going, like my workout is to go put on this 45-pound weights and walk for 2 hours, your brain looks, I think I'm kind of being a little bit facetious here, but I actually think there is some process like this that happens where it says, all right, how much energy or resource do I have?
Yeah.
And it goes, I've got like just this little bit. I've got like 2 points of energy or resource. And I'm about to go ruck for 2 hours. How many points of energy does that take? Well, it takes 12. And we go, well, that's not going to work. There's no way I'm going to do that. So I don't do it. If on the other hand, you go, you know what? Just put on the rucking vest and get to the corner. Your brain will look at that and go, how much energy does that take? Oh, it takes 2 points. Oh, I've got about 2 points. I think I can do that. Right. And then momentum tends to carry us. So I use that trick so many times.
Oh, yeah.
So many times, but it really works.
Very cool. Very cool. Another question I kind of had, and this is off track, but I was thinking whenever you were talking, you've been an entrepreneur your whole life, it sounds like. In your experience, there's a high correlation between entrepreneurship and some of these like co-occurring issues like addiction, bipolar disorder, and some of the things that are bad for us are also helpful in the entrepreneurial world. And I'm throwing it out there. It's a question, just like, would you agree with that? Have you observed that in your own life and other people that you know? Because almost all the entrepreneurs I know are crazy. In one way or the other, myself included.
Yeah, there tends to be certainly a correlation of intensity and obsessiveness. Yep. There is, I think. You have to be somewhat obsessed to be an entrepreneur. I don't think we have to be as obsessed as the culture often paints. And I think there are
culture, right?
I think there are antidotes to the traditional entrepreneurial culture world out there. And I think those are starting to emerge, and that's healthy. But yeah, I do think there's a correlation. I interviewed a guy for the show, and I don't remember what his book was, but it was something like All Great Leaders Are Drug Addicts, or I don't know what. It's not quite that, but it's along those lines. So I do think there is, and I do know that there have been times that my relationship to work isn't incredibly healthy. I have generally, when I've faced that, I've generally gone, well, you know what? It's a whole lot healthier than shooting heroin. So you know what? Carry on. Right. Yeah. But I do think that as we are in recovery, and whether that recovery is from substance abuse or mental disorder, or as in the case, very often both, right? I do think that the road gets narrower. And what I mean by that is things that 10 years ago I would have thought were perfectly fine, I now look at and go, that's not the best version of myself.
Yeah.
So my relationship to work has really changed. Almost, sometimes I think almost too far. I'm like, where did that drive go? Where did that desire to like on
that
fire?
Drive is not, I mean, it'll kill us. It'll eat us up.
And we could talk for an hour about that whole topic, right? Like I find it fascinating because as age comes together, as wisdom comes together, as certain spiritual experiences come together, our way of relating to the world changes. And for those of us who are very driven by things of the world, when that starts to change, it can feel profoundly disorienting.
Yes.
So I do think there is some relation there. And, I think that, there's nothing necessarily wrong with working a lot. But everything's an opportunity cost. What are you not doing when you're working a lot? Are you not spending time with your family? Are you not engaging in your recovery program? Are you not engaging in taking care of your mental health, right? That's why working too much can be bad. Not because there's anything wrong with working a lot.
Right.
It's because it's taking you away from other things that are important to you becoming a well-rounded and full human being. But some people don't want that. They are
I
like,
think maturity has something to do with it. Like, I know when I was younger, I was all into it. I had this experience. I'll never forget this. This was one of my first businesses, and I was a young guy. And the person that I was partnering with, he said to me, he's like, look, man, he was like 55, 60 years old at the time. He said, look, he called me Hoss. He said, look, Hoss, I got no interest in doing one of these like off the back of a napkin startups. You know what I mean? He's like, I'm not going to do that again. If you want a partner who's going to be reasonable, I'm your guy. But if you want somebody who's going to work 90 hours a week, I did my time. I'm done with that.
Yep.
And I remember that. And I remember thinking to myself, that's weird that he's saying that. Why would he not just, go at it? But it's maturity to a certain degree.
Yes.
I'm like, I don't want to be like that anymore.
Me neither. Me neither. I mean, I think the work that I do in the podcast that I do, I often am like, I wish I had started this when I was like 33, because I think I would have the amount of energy and time I would have poured into it,
Right.
I don't do that now, but I'm also perfectly happy with that decision. I don't, I was fortunate enough to hire a business coach a few years ago who I continue to work with. And he set up an idea really early on that has been really fundamental. And he was like, what we're working to do here is build a business that supports your life, not that your life has to support your business.
That's so interesting.
Love that.
And so it made me, so things started happening off of that. Like I was like, you know what, I'm going to try and take a month off and I never contemplated, like I never had, I maybe had 2 weeks off once since I was like 13 years old.
Yeah.
It was always a week off at most. And even that, not very frequently. So this idea that I'm going to take a month off, but now I'm like, oh shit, I'm going to do this twice a year, every year, because it's better for my life. But I also realized it was better for me as a business person. It was better for me as a podcaster. It was better for me as a coach. I came back in a new mindset. So this idea of, what is the business intended to do? Many people, and I coach entrepreneurs too. And, a lot of times we're so focused on making the thing work, making it a success so I can get rid of my day job and do this other thing, that we paint ourselves into an entirely new corner that isn't necessarily any better. And so you've put all this time and energy in, and you're like, I feel just as trapped as I did then. Right? That doesn't make any sense.
No, because one of the reasons why you got into it on your own was so you didn't feel trapped and you wanted to be your own boss and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And, I mean, there was a phase where after I was able to leave my corporate work to do the podcast and the other stuff full time, the way I did that was by ramping up my coaching business. And I coached a lot of people. And I hit a point where I was like, this is better than going to work at a software company where we're talking, my job is to figure out how we ship more jeans out of the distribution center faster. This is more important and valuable work. So good. And you know what? I am still like I've boxed myself in a new corner.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
even if it's serving others, you can overdo anything.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I know that we're getting close to time, and I do want our listeners to be able to, because I really want to hear more and more and more of your wisdom. Is there a platform where they can go and learn from you, like digitally, or do you have to be a personal coach for everybody? How can they get more of your wisdom just by listening to the podcast? Or I keep seeing something pop up to sign up for on your podcast.
Yeah. The podcast is the primary work that's out there, and it's free. And 2 episodes come out every week, and I'm extraordinarily proud of it. And I feel like I think it's a great show, and I think there's lots of great wisdom there. Once a year now, I run a program called Spiritual Habits. It's in the spring, and it's a group program that people can get involved in. I think that's a great program. And occasionally I take on coaching clients, but not so many anymore. And I'm not incredibly affordable either in that regard, which is why I
Right.
keep a free podcast all the time. Those are the basic ways to engage right now. It's partially why I'm working on a book too, is to have a lot of that wisdom out there in book form that,
Good.
that most anybody can afford.
Will it be called The One You Feed?
It will not. I'm not entirely sure what it's going to be called. But it's based on the Spiritual Habits program in general, which is basically my attempt to say, how can we use behavior, what we know about behavior change and all that, how can we use that to optimize wisdom instead of just optimizing productivity or our physical health? Or not that those things aren't important, they all are, but how do we use it to optimize actually becoming more wise in the world and actually changing the way we relate to the world?
Love it. Good
Love
stuff,
it.
man.
Yeah. Well, Eric, just thank you so much. And I want you guys to stick around for 1 second after we hang up. But Rich, do you have anything else you want to ask? Or Eric, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I guess I did. What I didn't say is, you can find all the work that I do at oneyoufeed.net. So it's ONEYOUFEED.net, or search for the One You Feed in any podcast player.
And I will link.
No, I would only, Liz, I would just encourage our folks out there, our listeners, to like really check into this. I love the way you frame things up, Eric. And I think, again, we attract some people that have maybe alternative views on recovery and are looking for other answers. If you're one of those folks, and maybe you're struggling or maybe you're having a tough time, don't give up. Look at all possible options. Hit this podcast and get started. Like I love, again, this idea of starting small if you can't start big. And get something positive, some positive recovery momentum going.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, man.
Yeah. If I could piggyback on that just as one last thing is, when I was in AA, we, at the end of every meeting, we said, keep coming back, which was, to me, meant like, just keep trying.
Yes.
Like if you're trying to get sober, keep trying. Now, it doesn't mean keep coming back to AA. You don't have to do that. There are lots of different things, but keep trying, because for almost everybody, it takes a while to figure out how to recover. Very few people walk in and you're like, oh, I'm just going to do this, and suddenly they get better. Like it takes a lot of attempts. So keep coming back, keep trying, because recovery is possible.
Nice.
Wonderful. We will end with that. Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next time on You Learn, You Turn.